The year was 1945. Europe was burning, and one man was racing toward the heart of Germany. But deep inside the collapsing Third Reich, a desperate general made a terrifying decision. He unleashed 58 brand new Panther tanks, the deadliest machines of their time, with one mission: stop General Patton at all costs. These were not old tanks. These were fresh from the factories, built to kill, built to dominate. And yet, within hours, the battlefield would prove something shocking, because power alone does not win wars. Strategy does, and Patton had both. This is the true story of the moment when Germany's best weapons collided with America's most relentless general, and only one could survive. We'll explain everything in this video step by step. Don't skip it. On one side stood the German army, battered but not broken. Their cities lay in ruins, their air filled with the echo of Allied bombers, their roads clogged with retreating soldiers. Yet within this chaos, a German general made a fateful decision, a final gamble in a war slipping through his fingers. He ordered 58 brand new Panther tanks into battle. Not worn-out relics, not patched-up machines, but fresh, deadly, and technologically superior Panthers, the pride of German engineering, sleek, lethal, and built to dominate the battlefield. Their engines roared like beasts awakening from a long slumber, their cannons capable of tearing through Allied armor from terrifying distances. These were not just tanks. They were Germany's last hope, and their mission was simple: stop one man. General George S. Patton. To the Allies, Patton was not just a commander. He was a force of nature, fast, ruthless, and brilliant. A general who moved like lightning across Europe, shattering German defenses before they even knew what had hit them. His Third Army didn't advance, it surged, it didn't fight, it overwhelmed. Where Patton went, fear followed. The German high command knew this. They had studied his tactics, tracked his movements, and listened to the thunder of his advancing columns. And now, as Patton's forces pushed deeper into German territory, they realized a terrifying truth. If Patton was not stopped here, Germany would fall even faster. So the order was given. 58 Panthers rolled forward under a gray, oppressive sky. Their tracks crushed the broken earth beneath them. Inside each tank sat young German soldiers, some hardened veterans, others barely out of their teens, all carrying the weight of a doomed nation on their shoulders. They advanced not in arrogance, but in desperation. Meanwhile, Patton's men were moving with brutal efficiency. American Shermans, armored vehicles, and infantry units spread across the battlefield like a steel tide. Radios crackled, engines growled, soldiers tightened their grips knowing that something massive was coming. And then contact. The first Panther emerged through the smoke like a phantom of destruction. Its long-barreled cannon locked onto a Sherman in the distance, a flash, a thunderous blast, and in an instant, the American tank erupted into fire. More Panthers followed, 10, 20, 30, then all 58. The battlefield turned into a hellscape. Shells screamed through the air, steel clashed against steel, flames licked the sky as tanks exploded in blinding fireballs. Men fought not as soldiers but as survivors, trapped in a violent dance between life and death. For a moment it seemed like Patton's advance might actually be halted. The Panthers were superior in firepower. Their armor was thicker. Their guns were deadlier. And German tank crews fighting for their homeland fought with ferocity born of desperation. But Patton was not a man who retreated. He adapted. He maneuvered. He outthought his enemy. Instead of meeting the Panthers head-on, Patton unleashed his artillery. American guns thundered across the horizon, raining down explosive fury on the advancing German tanks. Fighter planes screamed overhead, diving toward the battlefield with rockets and machine guns blazing. The Panthers, once unstoppable, were now hunted. One by one they began to fall. Tracks were blown apart. Turrets were torn from hulls. Flames poured from shattered metal. The proud German machines, once symbols of technological superiority, became burning wrecks littered across the battlefield. Inside them, brave German crews fought to the last. Some burning with their tanks, others captured. Their mission failed. And as the smoke cleared, Patton's armor rolled forward once again. The 58 Panthers had been sent to stop him, but they had failed. Patton continued his relentless push into Germany, proving that in modern war, speed, coordination, and strategy could defeat even the most advanced machines. This was not just a battle of tanks. It was a clash between desperation and determination, between a collapsing empire and a dancing liberator, between a general trying to save a dying nation and a general destined to reshape history. And in the end, the battlefield whispered a brutal truth. Even the most powerful machines cannot stop a commander driven by sheer will and an army fueled by unstoppable momentum. The war in Europe in its final year was no longer a grand conflict of maneuver and ideals. It had become a slow, suffocating collapse of a regime that refused to admit it was already dead. By 1945, the Third Reich was not fighting for victory anymore. It was fighting to delay its execution. Cities that once echoed with parades and propaganda now lay in smoking ruins. Factories that had fueled the German war machine were reduced to twisted metal. Railways were shattered, bridges blown apart, and entire divisions were melting away under relentless Allied pressure. Yet within this atmosphere of defeat, denial still clung to the German high command like a stubborn dice. Inside underground bunkers and heavily guarded headquarters, German generals pored over maps stained with coffee, sweat, and frustration. Their once clear strategic plans had disintegrated into desperate improvisation. The Eastern Front was collapsing under the weight of the Soviet advance, while in the West, American and British forces were breaking through at a speed that shocked even seasoned officers. The Wehrmacht, once feared across Europe, was now a battered force stretched far beyond its limits. Soldiers were exhausted, ammunition was scarce, and morale was crumbling. Amid this chaos, one German general found himself facing an impossible dilemma. He knew, as many of his colleagues secretly did, that the war was lost. But surrender was not an option in a system built on fanaticism, fear, and blind obedience to Adolf Hitler. Retreat was seen as betrayal. Withdrawal was labeled cowardice. The only acceptable path was to fight, even when there was nothing left to fight for. Patton's Third Army was cutting through Germany like a blade through paper. Reports of his rapid advances reached German command posts with a sense of dread. Towns fell in days, sometimes hours. German defensive lines that were supposed to hold for weeks crumbled in mere moments. Patton was not just advancing, he was humiliating the German army, proving that its once vaunted tactical brilliance had faded into disarray. The general understood that if Patton was allowed to continue unchallenged, D would drive straight into the heart of Germany, shattering whatever remained of organized resistance. This was not just a military threat, it was an existential one. To the Nazi leadership, Patton represented everything they feared: unstoppable power, relentless momentum, and the inevitability of their downfall. It was in this atmosphere of desperation that the decision was made to commit one of Germany's last significant armored reserves, 58 brand new Panther tanks. These were not random vehicles pulled from scattered units. They were some of the finest machines German industry had ever produced, rushed from factories that were themselves under constant Allied bombardment. Each Panther represented thousands of hours of engineering, scarce resources, and the last remnants of Germany's industrial strength. For the general, sending these Panthers into battle was not a calculated tactical move. It was a gamble born of despair. He knew the risks. Fuel shortages meant that many tanks might not even reach the battlefield. Allied air superiority meant they could be destroyed before they ever fired a shot. Mechanical failures, a constant issue with late-war German vehicles, could render many of them useless. But he had no better options. Infantry units were depleted, artillery was in short supply, and there was simply nothing else powerful enough to even slow Patton down. Inside the tanks sat young German crews, many of them barely old enough to shave. They had grown up on der Nazi propaganda, taught to believe in the invincibility of the Reich. Yet now, as they prepared for battle, reality stared them in the face. They knew they were outmatched in numbers, outgunned in the skies, and outmaneuvered on the ground. Still, they followed orders, gripping their controls with trembling hands as their engines roared to life. The Panthers moved forward like a steel fist, rolling through devastated countryside where entire villages had been reduced to rubble. Burned-out houses, shattered church steeples, and abandoned farms dotted the landscape. Civilians who had once supported the regime now hid in cellars, praying that the war would pass them by. The tanks advanced not as symbols of strength, but as instruments of a dying empire's final act of defiance. Back at German headquarters, the general watched reports come in with a mixture of hope and dread. He knew that if this attack failed, there would be no second chance. There were no more reserves waiting in the wings, no hidden divisions ready to spring into action. This was, in every sense, the last roll of the dice. The decision to send 58 Panthers was also deeply tied to the psychological state of the German leadership. Even as defeat loomed, they clung to the belief that a single decisive blow could change everything. They had convinced themselves that if they could just stop Patton, even temporarily, they might buy enough time to reorganize, regroup, or somehow negotiate from a position of strength. It was an illusion, but one they desperately needed to believe in. As the tanks rumbled closer to the front lines, the weight of history pressed down on them. These Panthers were not just machines. They were the physical embodiment of Germany's wartime ambitions, advanced technology, ruthless efficiency, and uncompromising aggression. Yet now, instead of spearheading conquest, they were being used in a futile attempt to delay the inevitable collapse of the very regime that had created them. The general's gamble reflected the tragedy of late war Germany. A powerful military trapped in service to a doomed ideology, capable of producing extraordinary weapons, but incapable of escaping the consequences of its own brutality. Every mile the Panthers traveled carried with it the ghosts of millions who had died because of the regime they represented. Somewhere ahead of them, Patton's forces were moving with relentless confidence. American soldiers, backed by superior logistics, air power, and coordination, had no idea that dozens of Germany's most formidable tanks were barreling toward them. The stage was being set not just for a battle, but for a confrontation between two very different worlds, one desperate and collapsing, the other determined and advancing. In sending those 58 Panthers, the German general was not merely deploying armor, he was making a final statement of resistance, a last attempt to assert control in a war that had long since slipped beyond his grasp. A gesture born of pride, fear, and the stubborn refusal to accept that the Reich he served was already nothing more than a shadow slowly dissolving into smoke, fire, and shattered steel. The war in Europe in its final year was no longer a grand conflict of maneuver and ideals. It had become a slow, suffocating collapse of a regime that refused to admit it was already dead. By 1945, the Third Reich was not fighting for victory anymore. It was fighting to delay its execution. Cities that once echoed with parades and propaganda now lay in smoking ruins. Factories that had fueled the German war machine were reduced to twisted metal. Railways were shattered, bridges blown apart, and entire divisions were melting away under relentless Allied pressure. Yet within this atmosphere of defeat, denial still clung to the German high command like a stubborn disease. Inside underground bunkers and heavily guarded headquarters, German generals pored over maps stained with coffee, sweat, and frustration. Their once clear strategic plans had disintegrated into desperate improvisation. The Eastern Front was collapsing under the weight of the Soviet advance, while in the West, American and British forces were breaking through at a speed that shocked even seasoned officers. The Wehrmacht, once feared across Europe, was now a battered force stretched far beyond its limits. Soldiers were exhausted, ammunition was scarce, and morale was crumbling. Amid this chaos, one German general found himself facing an impossible dilemma. He knew, as many of his colleagues secretly did, that the war was lost. But surrender was not an option in a system built on fanaticism, fear, and blind obedience to Adolf Hitler. Retreat was seen as betrayal. Withdrawal was labeled cowardice. The only acceptable path was to fight, even when there was nothing left to fight for. Patton's Third Army was cutting through Germany like a blade through paper. Reports of his rapid advances reached German command posts with a sense of dread. Towns fell in days, sometimes hours. German defensive lines that were supposed to hold for weeks crumbled in mere moments. Patton was not just advancing. He was humiliating the German army, proving that its once vaunted tactical brilliance had faded into disarray. The general understood that if Patton was allowed to continue unchallenged, he would drive straight into the heart of Germany, shattering whatever remained of organized resistance. This was not just a military threat, it was an existential one. To the Nazi leadership, Patton represented everything they feared: unstoppable power, relentless momentum, and the inevitability of their downfall. It was in this atmosphere of desperation that the decision was made to commit one of Germany's last significant armored reserves, 58 brand new Panther tanks. These were not random vehicles pulled from scattered units. They were some of the finest machines German industry had ever produced, rushed from factories that were themselves under constant Allied bombardment. Each Panther represented thousands of hours of engineering, scarce resources, and the last remnants of Germany's industrial strength. For the general, sending these Panthers into battle was not a calculated tactical move. It was a gamble born of despair. He knew the risks. Fuel shortages meant that many tanks might not even reach the battlefield. Allied air superiority meant they could be destroyed before they ever fired a shot. Mechanical failures, a constant issue with late-war German vehicles, could render many of them useless. But he had no better options. Infantry units were depleted, artillery was in short supply, and there was simply nothing else powerful enough to even slow Patton down. Inside the tanks sat young German crews, many of them barely old enough to shave. They had grown up under Nazi propaganda, taught to believe in the invincibility of the Reich. Yet now, as they prepared for battle, reality stared them in the face. They knew they were outmatched in numbers, outgunned in the skies, and outmaneuvered on the ground. Still, they followed orders, gripping their controls with trembling hands as their engines roared to life. The Panthers moved forward like a steel fist, rolling through devastated countryside where entire villages had been reduced to rubble. Burned out houses, shattered church steeples, and abandoned farms dotted the landscape. Civilians who had once supported the regime now hid in cellars, praying that the war would pass them by. The tanks advanced not as symbols of strength, but as instruments of a dying empire's final act of defiance. Back at German headquarters, the general watched reports come in with a mixture of hope and dread. He knew that if this attack failed, there would be no second chance. There were no more reserves waiting in the wings, no hidden divisions ready to spring into action. This was, in every sense, the last roll of the dice. The decision to send 58 Panthers was also deeply tied to the psychological state of the German leadership. Even as defeat loomed, they clung to the belief that a single decisive blow could change everything. They had convinced themselves that if they could just stop Patton, even temporarily, they might buy enough time to reorganize, regroup, or somehow negotiate from a position of strength. It was an illusion, but one they desperately needed to believe in. As the tanks rumbled closer to the front lines, the weight of history pressed down on them. These Panthers were not just machines, they were the physical embodiment of Germany's wartime ambitions, advanced technology, ruthless efficiency, and uncompromising aggression. Yet now, instead of spearheading conquest, they were being used in a futile attempt to delay the inevitable collapse of the very regime that had created them. The general's gamble reflected the tragedy of late-war Germany, a powerful military trapped in service to a doomed ideology, capable of producing extraordinary weapons, but incapable of escaping the consequences of its own brutality. Every mile the Panthers traveled carried with it the ghosts of millions who had died because of the regime they represented. Somewhere ahead of them, Patton's forces were moving with relentless confidence. American soldiers, backed by superior logistics, air power, and coordination, had no idea that dozens of Germany's most formidable tanks were barreling toward them. The stage was being set not just for a battle, but for a confrontation between two very different worlds, one desperate and collapsing, the other determined and advancing. In sending those 58 Panthers, the German general was not merely deploying armor. He was making a final statement of resistance, a last attempt to assert control in a war that had long since slipped beyond his grasp, a gesture born of pride, fear, and the stubborn refusal to accept that the Reich he served was already nothing more than a shadow slowly dissolving into smoke, fire, and shattered steel. The Panther tank was, in many ways, the perfect expression of Germany's late-war mindset, technologically brilliant, visually intimidating, and tragically out of step with the realities of the battlefield it was built to fight on. Designed as a response to the Soviet T-34, the Panther was not just another armored vehicle. It was a weapon born from both fear and arrogance. German engineers poured their mastery into its design, determined to create a machine that would restore their dominance on the battlefield, even as the war around them was slipping beyond their control. Its sloped armor gave it a sleek, predatory appearance, as if it were not merely a machine, but a living creature stalking its prey. This design was not just aesthetic. It made the tank far more resistant to Allied and Soviet fire. Shells that would have easily penetrated earlier German tanks often glanced off the Panther's angled plates, deflecting away and leaving the crew inside alive. To many Allied tankers, encountering a Panther felt less like facing a vehicle and more like confronting a steel fortress that moved with terrifying grace. At its heart was a long-barreled 75mm KWK-42 gun, one of the most feared tank cannons of the entire war. This was not a weapon meant for close, chaotic brawls. It was built for precision and long-range lethality. A Panther could destroy an American Sherman or British Cromwell from distances where those tanks could barely even threaten it in return. German crews were trained to use this advantage, striking from afar, picking off enemies methodically before they could close the gap. The Panther was also a paradox. While devastating in combat, it was mechanically fragile. Its advanced engineering made it difficult to produce, maintain, and repair, especially in the desperate final months of the war. Parts were scarce, factories were being bombed, and rush production meant many Panthers left assembly lines with serious flaws. Still, when they worked as intended, they were among the most formidable tanks ever fielded. Against this backdrop of technological power stood Patton's Third Army, a completely different kind of force where the Panther represented German perfectionism and rigid doctrine. Patton's momentum embodied speed, flexibility, and relentless aggression. His armored columns did not move cautiously. They surged forward like a breaking dam, flowing around obstacles rather than battering against them. Patton understood something fundamental about modern warfare that many German commanders struggled to accept. Wars were no longer won solely by superior machines, but by superior systems. His tanks, mostly M4 Shermans, were technically inferior to Panthers in terms of armor and firepower, but they were reliable, easy to repair, and available in overwhelming numbers. For every Panther Germany could field, the Americans could often deploy 3 or 4 Shermans. More importantly, Patton did not rely on tanks alone. His strength lay in coordination, a lethal blend of armor, infantry, artillery, and air power working together as a single organism. His columns moved with the precision of a well-oiled machine, each part supporting the others, adapting in real time to the chaos of battle. To the German general who ordered the 58 Panthers forward, this contrast was both infuriating and terrifying. He knew that on paper his Panthers should dominate any tank battle. In an ideal confrontation, a Panther could pick apart Patton's armor with brutal efficiency. But war was never fought on paper, and Patton was not the kind of commander who would grant his enemy such a luxury. As the Panthers rolled toward the front, their presence alone carried a psychological weight. To German soldiers, they were symbols of pride, reminders that their nation could still produce world-class weapons even in its darkest hour. Many clung to the hope that these tanks might turn the tide, that their sheer power could blunt Patton's advance and restore some semblance of balance to the war. For the Allied forces, however, the Panther had become almost a myth, whispered about in mess halls, feared in combat reports, respected even by those who fought against it. American tank crews knew that a direct head-on engagement with a Panther was often a death sentence. Stories circulated of Shermans being destroyed in a single shot, of Panthers appearing like ghosts through smoke and mist before unleashing devastating fire. Yet Patton's momentum was not built on fear of the enemy, but on confidence in his own methods. He did not view the Panther as an invincible monster, but as a challenge to be outmaneuvered rather than confronted directly. Where German doctrine emphasized armored superiority, Patton emphasized speed and unpredictability. He preferred to strike where the enemy was weak, to flank rather than fight fair, to overwhelm rather than outgun. This clash of philosophies lay at the heart of what was about to unfold. The Panthers represented the pinnacle of German tank design, the best their shattered industry could still produce. Patton's forces represented the industrial might of the United States at full strength, backed by endless supplies, fuel, and air support. One side relied on technological brilliance, the other on sheer logistical power and tactical flexibility. Inside each Panther, German crews prepared themselves for a battle they knew would be unlike anything they had faced before. They had been trained to expect traditional tank engagements, lines of armored vehicles trading fire across open fields, but Patton's battlefield was far more chaotic. His units moved rapidly, struck from unexpected angles, and rarely fought in the way German commanders anticipated. As the Panthers advanced, their engines growled with deep mechanical authority, shaking the ground beneath them. To anyone watching from a distance, they must have appeared unstoppable, a line of steel giants moving with grim determination. Their commanders scanned the horizon through periscopes, searching for the first sign of American armor. Meanwhile, Patton's units were already in motion, spreading across the terrain like a living network. Reconnaissance teams probed ahead, artillery units prepared firing solutions, and fighter bombers circled in the skies above, ready to swoop down at a moment's notice. Patton did not wait for his enemy to come to him. He positioned his forces to respond instantly, to absorb the impact, and then strike back with crushing force. The true power of Patton's momentum lay not just in his tanks, but in his mindset. He believed in relentless pressure, in never allowing the enemy time to breathe or reorganize. Even when faced with superior weapons like the Panther, he refused to slow down. To him, hesitation was more dangerous than any German cannon. This created a stark imbalance on the battlefield. The Panthers were powerful, but they moved within a collapsing system. Fuel shortages limited their range. Communication breakdowns hampered coordination. German infantry support was often weak or non-existent. Patton's forces, by contrast, operated within a system that grew stronger with every mile they advanced. As the distance between the two sides closed, the contrast between them became almost symbolic. The Panthers embodied a nation fighting desperately to preserve its past, clinging to advanced technology as a last lifeline. Patton's Third Army embodied a future defined by speed, integration, and overwhelming industrial strength for the German general who had sent the Panthers forward. This realization must have been agonizing. He had placed his hopes in machines that, while extraordinary, could not compensate for the crumbling reality around them. He was betting on steel and firepower to stop a force driven by momentum, coordination, and sheer will. The stage was now set for a confrontation that went far beyond tanks and guns. It was a collision between two different ways of waging war. One rooted in precision engineering and rigid doctrine, the other in fluid movement and adaptive strategy. The Panthers were not just rolling into battle, they were rolling into a clash of eras where their technological brilliance would be tested not just by enemy shells, but by the unstoppable current of Patton's advance. The first contact did not arrive with ceremony or warning, only with the sudden, violent shattering of silence that had blanketed the battlefield like a fragile illusion. Dawn was still clawing its way across the horizon, painting the broken countryside in pale shades of gray and amber, when the stillness was ripped apart by the distant growl of engines and the metallic grinding of tank tracks chewing through churned earth. Fog clung low over the fields, drifting like wounded ghosts between burned-out farmhouses, shattered hedgerows, and the skeletal remains of trees blasted apart by weeks of relentless fighting. In that quiet, trembling moment before battle, the world seemed suspended between life and annihilation. Patton's men were already awake long before the sun fully rose. They had learned that in this war, daylight was a luxury, and survival depended on constant vigilance. American tank crews sat inside their Shermans, coffee gone cold in their cups, eyes red from exhaustion but sharpened by instinct. Infantry units moved cautiously along muddy roads, boots sinking into the soaked ground, rifles held tight against their chests. Radios crackled with low static, carrying fragmented reports of German armor movement somewhere beyond the veil of morning mist. Then, without warning, the fog was torn apart by a blinding flash of fire. The first Panther appeared like a steel phantom, materializing from another world. Its long, deadly barrel pierced through the haze, locking onto an American Sherman positioned near a small, ruined farmhouse. For a heartbeat, everything stood still. The German gunner exhaled, adjusted his aim, and squeezed the trigger. The explosion that followed was deafening, a thunderous roar that seemed to shake the very earth beneath both armies. The Sherman was ripped open as if it were made of paper, flames erupting from its hull in a violent burst of orange and black. Turret fragments flew through the air, and the screams of trapped crew members were swallowed by the chaos that instantly engulfed the battlefield. In that single, brutal moment, the battle had begun. More Panthers surged forward, their silhouettes emerging one by one through the dissipating fog. 10, then 20, then what seemed like an endless wave of armored beasts grinding relentlessly toward Patton's lines. Their engines roared in unison, a deep, terrifying chorus that echoed across the countryside like the heartbeat of an approaching storm. Each tank moved with deliberate, calculated precision, turrets rotating, cannons scanning for targets, machine guns ready to spray death at any infantry foolish enough to stand in their path. The American soldiers, caught between awe and terror, reacted instinctively. Shermans pivoted their turrets, desperately trying to acquire targets through the smoke and dust. Artillery crews scrambled to adjust their guns, shouting frantic orders over the din of exploding shells. Infantrymen dove for cover behind walls, ditches, and wreckage, pressing themselves flat against the ground as the Panthers advanced with merciless confidence. The first exchanges were devastating. German shells tore through American armor with terrifying efficiency. Shermans that had survived countless skirmishes were reduced to burning wrecks in seconds. One tank exploded so violently that its turret was hurled several meters into the air before crashing down with a metallic scream. Another was hit squarely in the front. Its armor split apart like cracked glass, sending a shockwave that knocked nearby soldiers off their feet. But Patton's men did not break. Even as the battlefield descended into hell, they fought back with grim determination. American tankers fired round after round, some shells bouncing harmlessly off the Panthers' sloped armor, others finding weaker points and tearing into German steel with brutal force. The air filled with the shriek of ricochets, the thunder of cannons, and the choking stench of burning fuel and scorched metal. Infantry units moved with desperate courage, darting between craters and ruins, trying to get close enough to enemy tanks to use bazookas or plant explosives. Many never made it. German machine guns mounted on the Panthers cut them down with ruthless precision, bullets slicing through the air like invisible blades. Men fell screaming, clutching shattered limbs, or lay still in the mud, their lives extinguished in an instant. Above them, the sky itself seemed to tremble as artillery from both sides joined the fray. American guns opened up with earth-shattering fury, shells whistling through the air before crashing down among the advancing Panthers. Explosions ripped apart sections of the German formation, sending debris and shrapnel flying in every direction. The ground quaked, trees splintered, and entire stretches of field were transformed into smoldering craters. Yet still the Panthers pushed forward. To the German crews inside, this was the moment they had trained for, the proving ground of their nation's most powerful weapon. Sweat dripped down their faces as they fired, reloaded, and fired again, each shot echoing through the cramped steel interior like a hammer striking an anvil. Some tanks moved with terrifying fluidity, maneuvering around obstacles, flanking American positions, and pouring fire into Patton's lines with cold efficiency. From the American perspective, it felt like facing an unstoppable force. For every Panther they managed to destroy, another seemed to take its place. The battlefield became a WWII, stead maze of burning vehicles, shattered equipment, and fallen bodies. Smoke rose in thick, suffocating clouds that blotted out the sun, turning day into a murky twilight filled with shadows and fire. Amid this carnage, individual acts of heroism and desperation unfolded in every corner of the battlefield. One American tank commander, seeing his unit being overwhelmed, drove straight toward an advancing Panther in a suicidal charge, firing wildly until his Sherman was obliterated in a massive explosion. Nearby, a group of infantrymen worked together to drag a wounded comrade out of the line of fire, bullets whipping past them as they refused to abandon him. Inside the Panthers, German crews faced their own nightmare. Some tanks were hit by artillery, their tracks blown apart, leaving them immobilized and vulnerable. Others suffered mechanical failures, engines sputtering and dying at the worst possible moment. In one particularly harrowing scene, a Panther was struck by a shell that pierced its side, igniting the fuel inside and turning the tank into a blazing inferno. The crew tried desperately to escape, but only one managed to crawl out before the entire vehicle exploded in a fiery blast. The clash between the two armored forces was not a clean, orderly battle, but a chaotic, brutal struggle for survival. Tanks collided with debris, got stuck in craters, and maneuvered through a landscape that had been utterly transformed by war. Every inch of ground was contested, ever. Why, moment filled with the possibility of sudden death. As minutes stretched into what felt like hours, the intensity of the fighting reached a fever pitch. The roar of engines, the crack of gunfire, and the thunder of explosions blended into a single overwhelming symphony of destruction. Soldiers on both sides fought with a mixture of fear, adrenaline, and grim resolve, knowing that hesitation could mean instant annihilation. For a brief, terrifying period, it appeared as though the German Panthers might achieve what they had been sent to do. Their superior firepower and armor gave them a clear advantage in direct engagements, and Patton's forces found themselves pushed back in several sectors. Reports of heavy American losses began to spread along the front lines, adding to the sense of impending disaster. Yet even in this darkest moment, the battlefield was far from decided. Beneath the chaos, Patton's military machine was already beginning to adapt, repositioning units, calling in reinforcements, and preparing to unleash a counterblow that would transform this brutal first clash from a German triumph into something far more complex, a violent, smoke-choked baptism of fire that would forever define how both sides remembered this ferocious meeting of steel, fire, and human will. Patton did not see the battlefield the way most commanders did. Where others looked and saw chaos, smoke, and destruction, he saw patterns, movement, and opportunity. Even as the Panthers tore through his forward elements, burning Shermans and shredding infantry positions, Patton remained eerily calm. He was not a man who panicked in the face of superior enemy armor. Instead, his mind began working at a furious pace, calculating angles, distances, and responses with the instinct of a seasoned predator who had spent his entire life studying the art of war. From his command post, Patton listened to reports pouring in over crackling radios. His officers described the Panthers' advance, the losses suffered by his tank units, and the intensity of the German assault. Lesser generals might have ordered an immediate retreat or a desperate frontal counterattack. Patton did neither. He understood something fundamental that many of his enemies had failed to grasp. Battles were not won by the most powerful machines, but by the commander who could best control the flow of combat. Instead of trying to stop the Panthers head-on with his Shermans, Patton immediately shifted his focus toward neutralizing their advantages. He knew the Panthers' greatest strength lay in its long-range firepower and thick frontal armor. Meeting them directly in open terrain would only result in unnecessary American casualties. So he chose a different path, one based on maneuver, coordination, and overwhelming combined arms. His first move was to unleash his artillery. American guns, already positioned across the landscape, roared to life with earth-shaking fury. Massive shells screamed through the sky before crashing down among the advancing German tanks. The explosions were deafening, ripping apart soil, trees, and anything unfortunate enough to be caught in their blast radius. Some Panthers were thrown off balance, their tracks damaged or destroyed by the sheer force of the bombardment. Others were forced to halt their advance, their crews struggling to maintain control amid the storm of fire raining down upon them. Patton understood that artillery was not just a weapon of destruction. It was a tool of disruption. By hammering the Panthers relentlessly, he aimed to break their formation, slow their momentum, and create confusion among their crews. Even the most advanced tank becomes vulnerable when its movement is restricted or its commander loses situational awareness. As the artillery pounded the German lines, Patton coordinated his next move with surgical precision. He ordered his armored units to reposition rather than retreat. Instead of engaging the Panthers directly from the front, American tank columns began to fan out across the battlefield, seeking weaker points along the German flanks. Shermans moved quickly through hedgerows, along narrow roads, and across broken terrain where the heavier Panthers struggled to maneuver effectively. Patton's genius lay in his ability to think 3 steps ahead. He knew that while the Panther was deadly in open combat, it was less effective in close, chaotic fighting where its size and mechanical complexity became liability. ties. By forcing the battle into less predictable terrain, he could negate much of the Panthers' technical superiority. At the same time, Patton called upon one of his most devastating assets, air power. Above the battlefield, American fighter bombers had already been circling, waiting for the order to strike. When Patton gave the signal, they swooped down like falcons descending upon their prey. Rockets and bombs streaked toward the Panthers, exploding in massive fireballs that sent shockwaves rippling across the ground. Some German tanks were obliterated in seconds, their turrets torn from their hulls, flames pouring out of shattered compartments. For the German crews inside the Panthers, this was a nightmare they had always feared. No matter how powerful their armor, they were helpless against attacks from the sky. The once confident advance of the German armored column began to falter as tanks scrambled to evade the aerial assault, breaking formation and losing the coordination that had made them so effective moments earlier. Meanwhile, Patton's infantry moved with renewed purpose. Small teams of soldiers, armed with bazookas and anti-tank weapons, slipped through the chaos, using the artillery and airstrikes as cover. They approached immobilized or damaged Panthers with deadly intent, firing at weak points or placing explosives near tracks and engines. What had once been an unstoppable wave of German steel now became a field of burning wreckage and scattered resistance. Patton's strategy was not merely reactive. It was relentlessly proactive. As soon as one sector of the battlefield stabilized, he redirected his forces to apply pressure elsewhere. He refused to allow the Germans time to regroup or reorganize. Every move he made was designed to keep the Panthers off balance, forcing them to fight on his terms rather than their own. His ability to synchronize different elements of his army set him apart from many of his contemporaries. Artillery, armor, infantry, and air power were not separate forces under his command. They were interconnected parts of a single cohesive system. When one faltered, another stepped in to compensate. When one succeeded, the others followed through to exploit the advantage. Inside the German command structure, this adaptability was deeply unsettling. The general who had ordered the 58 Panthers forward had expected a relatively conventional armored engagement where superior German tanks could dominate the battlefield through sheer firepower. Instead, he found himself watching as his prized machines were dismantled not by better tanks, but by a far more sophisticated approach to warfare. As the battle unfolded, the contrast between the two sides became increasingly clear. The Panthers were still formidable, but they were fighting within a rigid, collapsing system that struggled to respond to Patton's fluid tactics. American forces, by contrast, moved with confidence, constantly adjusting, improvising, overwhelming their enemy through sheer coordination and persistence. Patton himself moved along the front lines, surveying the battlefield with a fierce intensity that inspired his men and terrified his enemies. He issued rapid orders, redirected units, and demanded absolute aggression from his commanders. To him, this was not just another battle. It was a test of his philosophy of warfare, a chance to prove that speed, flexibility, and relentless pressure could defeat even the most advanced armored force. As American artillery continued to hammer the Panthers and fighter bombers tore through their ranks, Patton's armored units began to close in from multiple directions. Shermans darted in and out of cover, striking at exposed sides and rear armor where the Panthers were most vulnerable. What had started as a one-sided German assault now transformed into a deadly multi-front struggle that the Panthers were ill-equipped to handle. German crews fought desperately to hold their ground. Some managed to destroy several Shermans before being overwhelmed. Others found themselves trapped, their tanks immobilized by damage or terrain, forced to surrender or perish inside their burning vehicles. The disciplined advance that had once defined their attack dissolved into scattered pockets of resistance. Patton's counterblow was not a single decisive strike, but a relentless series of calculated moves that gradually shifted the balance of power. He did not seek to annihilate the Panthers in one dramatic confrontation. Instead, he methodically wore them down, isolating them, dismantling their support, and crushing their momentum piece by piece. This approach reflected Patton's deeper understanding of modern warfare. He knew that battles were as much about psychology as they were about firepower. By refusing to be intimidated by the Panthers and responding with overwhelming coordination, he shattered not just their physical strength, but the confidence that had driven their advance. As the hours passed, the battlefield began to tell the story of Patton's strategy in stark visual terms. Where once there had been an organized line of German armor, there now lay a scattered graveyard of twisted metal and smoldering wrecks. American forces pressed forward, reclaiming ground that had seemed lost only moments before. Yet even as victory tilted toward Patton, the battle remained brutally intense. Every Panther that still functioned posed a lethal threat. Every German crew that refused to surrender fought with the ferocity of men who knew they had nothing left to lose. Patton's counterblow did not eliminate danger. It transformed it into a different kind of struggle, one defined by relentless pressure, adaptability, and the unyielding drive of an army that refused to be stopped by even the most formidable machines ever built. History often remembers wars through the lens of victories, defeats, and famous commanders, but beneath those surface narratives lies a deeper reality about why battles unfold the way they do. The clash between Patton's Third Army and the 58 Panthers sent to stop him was not simply a contest of machines or tactics. It was a reflection of how modern warfare had fundamentally changed by the final years of World War II. The failure of those Panthers to halt Patton's advance revealed truths about industrial power, logistics, human psychology, and the limits of technological superiority that went far beyond this single battlefield. The Panthers were among the most feared tanks of the war, yet their very existence was rooted in Germany's earlier miscalculations. They had been created in response to crises rather than as part of a long-term strategic vision. When German engineers first designed the Panther, they did so in shock after encountering the Soviet T-34, a tank that had exposed serious weaknesses in earlier German armor. This reactive approach meant the Panther was brilliant but rushed, powerful but fragile, and ultimately mismatched with the war Germany was now fighting. By the time these 58 brand new Panthers rolled toward Patton, Germany no longer possessed the industrial foundation that had once supported such advanced weapons. Factories were being bombed daily. Supply lines were broken. Skilled workers had been replaced by forced laborers or inexperienced civilians. Even as these tanks left the assembly lines, they were already products of a collapsing system. They symbolized technical genius trapped inside a nation that could no longer sustain it. On the battlefield, this imbalance became brutally clear. A single Panther could dominate a tank duel, but wars are not decided by single engagements. Patton's forces moved within a vast network of support. Fuel trucks, repair crews, ammunition convoys, field hospitals, reconnaissance units, and constant air cover. For every Sherman knocked out, another could be repaired or replaced within hours. For every American unit forced to pull back, reinforcements were already on the way. The Panthers, by contrast, were isolated. Once damaged, they were often abandoned because there were no spare parts or recovery vehicles available. A broken track or engine failure that might have been repairable earlier in the war now meant the tank was lost forever. Even if a Panther survived the battle, it might run out of fuel days later, leaving its crew stranded and vulnerable. Patton's success was therefore not just about his tactical brilliance, but about the overwhelming industrial might behind him. The United States had transformed warfare into a production line of victory where speed, quantity, and reliability mattered as much as, if not more than, raw technological superiority. The Panthers represented the last gasp of a system that had once dominated Europe through precision and discipline, but now found itself outmatched by a new kind of warfare built on mass, mobility, and integration. Psychologically, the failure of the 58 Panthers also exposed the difference in mindset between the two sides. German commanders still believed that a single decisive armored thrust could turn the tide of the war. They clung to the idea of a dramatic breakthrough, a powerful blow that would shatter Allied momentum and restore their authority. This belief was rooted in their early successes in the war, when blitzkrieg tactics had stunned Europe and delivered rapid victories. Patton, however, did not fight wars through dramatic gestures. His approach was relentless: pressure, constant movement, and an understanding that victory came from wearing down the enemy rather than gambling everything on one bold strike. The Panthers were sent as a final desperate attempt to recreate past glory, but Patton's entire method of warfare was designed to make such gambles obsolete. The human element of this battle further explains why the Panthers could not stop history's advance. Inside each of those tanks sat young German soldiers who had grown up under propaganda that promised triumph and invincibility. Many of them were fighting not out of conviction, but out of fear, duty, or simply because they had no choice. They were skilled, disciplined, and brave, but they were also exhausted, undersupplied, and painfully aware that their nation was collapsing around them. Patton's men, by contrast, fought with a growing sense of inevitability. They had seen victory after victory. They knew their supply lines were secure, their air support reliable, and their commander unwavering in his confidence. Even when facing superior tanks, they believed, rightly, that their combined strength would prevail. This difference in morale shaped every exchange on the battlefield, influencing how aggressively each side fought and how resilient they were under pressure. Another crucial factor was terrain and timing. The Panthers were designed for wide-open battlefields where they could use their long-range guns to full effect, but Patton deliberately fought in ways that denied them that advantage. He pushed the battle into broken terrain, villages, forests, and narrow roads, where the Panthers' size and limited maneuverability became liabilities. What had been a strength in theory turned into a weakness in practice. Air power also played a decisive role in why 58 Panthers could not stop Patton. No matter how thick their armor or how powerful their guns, they were nearly defenseless against fighter bombers. The moment Patton called in his aircraft, the Panthers were forced to scatter, lose formation, and fight on multiple fronts at once. This transformed what should have been a straightforward armored engagement into a chaotic struggle where German tanks were picked off from above and below. There is also a broader historical truth embedded in this moment. E-58 Panthers were sent to stop a man, but what they were really trying to stop was an entire system of warfare that Germany could no longer compete with. Patton was not just a general. He was the spearhead of an industrial, logistical, and technological machine that dwarfed anything the Third Reich could muster by 1945. In that sense, the failure of the Panthers was inevitable long before they ever fired their first shot. They were powerful tools wielded by a collapsing empire, facing an enemy that had mastered the art of total war. Even if those 58 tanks had destroyed twice as many Shermans, the outcome of the campaign and the war would have remained unchanged. Yet this does not diminish the significance of what they represented. Each Panther embodied years of German engineering, countless hours of labor, and the hopes of a regime that refused to accept its own demise. Their destruction was not just a military defeat, but a symbolic one. Proof that brilliance alone cannot win a war when it is not supported by resources, unity, and realistic strategy. For Patton, this battle reinforced his belief that speed, coordination, and psychological dominance were more decisive than any single weapon. He did not fear the Panthers because he understood their limitations. He knew that if he kept moving, kept striking, and kept the pressure relentless, even the most advanced enemy armor would eventually crumble. For the German general, who had ordered them forward, the failure of the Panthers was a devastating confirmation of everything he likely already knew in his heart. No matter how powerful his tanks were, they could not compensate for a broken supply system, shattered infrastructure, and a war that had already been lost in factories, skies, and strategic planning rooms far from the battlefield. On a deeper level, the story of the 58 Panthers speaks to the tragic irony of late war Germany. A nation capable of producing some of the most advanced weapons in history had trapped itself in a conflict it could no longer sustain. Its soldiers fought bravely, its engineers built marvels of technology, but its leadership had led it into a dead end from which there was no escape. Patton's unstoppable advance, therefore, was not just a personal triumph, but a manifestation of a larger historical shift. The era of war, dominated by elite, technically superior units, was giving way to an era defined by mass production, combined arms, and integrated warfare. The Panthers were relics of an old way of fighting, powerful but ultimately outmatched by a new paradigm that valued adaptability over perfection. Even today, historians look back on those 58 Panthers with a mixture of admiration and melancholy. Admiration for their design and the courage of their crews, and melancholy because they were sent into battle not as instruments of victory, but as symbols of a doomed regime's refusal to accept reality. Their inability to stop Patton serves as a reminder that in war, momentum, resources, and strategy often outweigh even the most formidable machines. Thank you for listening, and don't forget to like and subscribe.